This week, we'll be discussing the various links between natural resources and civil conflict, or domestic armed conflict. Civil conflicts are violent conflicts between a state, i.e., the government, and one or more organized non-state actors in the state's territory. Civil wars are thus distinguished from interstate conflicts, in which states fight other states, violent conflicts or riots not involving states, sometimes labeled intercommunal conflicts or ethnic rioting, and state repression against individuals who cannot be considered an organized or cohesive group, including genocides and similar types of violence by non-state actors, such as terrorism or violent crime. Some civil conflicts have international dimensions, such as when rebels operate across borders. Civil wars are often incredibly brutal affairs. Your mental model of a civil war may be one formed from your reading about the U.S. Civil War in high school. The U.S. Civil War was predominantly fought by regular forces with similar armaments, numbers, and on conventional battlefields. Civilian deaths, relative to combatant deaths, were comparatively rare. Civil War historian James McPherson has estimated that there were 50,000 civilian deaths during the Civil War, which means that the 620,000 estimated combatant deaths outnumbered civilian deaths by more than 10 to 1. In modern civil wars, that ratio is reversed, with the civilian population being the terrain on which the war is fought, as pitched battles between combatants are rare compared to attacks on civilian populations designed to deter or compel said population from supporting and providing aid to either the rebels or the government. The Angolan Civil War, for example, claimed about 7,500 battle deaths but resulted in over 500,000 civilian deaths and 4 million displaced persons, to say nothing of the damage done to infrastructure and long-term human health. Angola was and is one of the most heavily mined countries on Earth, with nearly 1,200 confirmed or suspected minefields laid during the Angolan Civil War and the preceding War for Independence from Portugal. Landmines are a cheap and relatively easy way to set a defensive perimeter or cover a retreat, and they're particularly dangerous for two reasons. First, they're extremely patient. Landmines placed during World War II still go off from time to time. Second, they do not care whether the person stepping on them is an advancing soldier, or a playing child, or a farmer tending to their fields. Landmine accidents have been so prevalent in Angola that a Miss Landmine pageant was held there in 2008 to raise awareness of the issue. We'll end this lecture by returning to the political economy of Angola's civil war, which helps explain why the civilian toll was so high. For this reason and others, civil conflicts are known as development in reverse, and one of the reasons why natural resource-rich countries lag behind more resource-poor countries in terms of economic and human development. We'll be focusing on conflict onset, or the outbreak of new conflicts or resumption of conflicts after a longish period of peace. An example of the former would be the Syrian Civil War, which broke out in 2011. Prior to 2011, the country had experienced about 4 decades of political stability. An example of the latter would be the Second Liberian Civil War, in which Charles Taylor, who had been a rebel leader in the original Civil War and who is now president, fought the Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy, or LURD, which was basically a reconstituted version of the United Liberation Movement for Democracy in Liberia, a rebel faction that had fought against Taylor's National People's Liberation Front, or NPLF, in the First Civil War. Yes, the acronyms fly hard and fast in the study of Civil War. Before we investigate mechanisms, we'll elaborate a typology linking the nature and geography of a resource to different conflict types. Philippe Le Bihan categorizes resources according to their proximity and their point source/diffuseness. By proximity, he means how close the resources are to the seat of government power, i.e. the capital. For example, Sierra Leone's diamond fields are in Kono District, far from the capital Freetown on the eastern side of the country, near the borders with Liberia and Guinea. Remember this point about the diamonds being located close to Liberia. We'll be coming back to it later. So those are an example of a distant resource. In contrast, much of Saudi Arabia's vast oil reserves are pumped comparatively close to the capital, Riyadh. They are a proximate resource. The second dimension is already familiar to you, point source versus diffuse, so we won't belabor it here. According to Le Bihan, each combination of point source versus diffuseness and proximate versus distant is associated with a different type of conflict. When resources are proximate and point source, you tend to have conflicts over control of the central state, or coups d'etat occurring within the regime itself. When resources are distant and point source, you tend to have separatist conflicts. When resources are proximate and diffuse, you tend to have peasant insurgencies. And finally, when resources are distant and diffuse, you get warlordism. We'll set aside peasant rebellions, as these tend to occur most over renewable resources, not non-renewable resources. Coups d'etat are rapid seizures of power, typically undertaken by members of the government, the ruler's family, or the military. For example, earlier this year, President of Guinea Alpha Conde was captured by the country's armed forces in a coup d'etat after some gunfire in the capital. Special Forces Commander Mamadi Doumbouya released a broadcast on state television announcing the dissolution of the constitution and the government and appointing himself in charge. Separatist or secessionist conflicts are those in which the rebels seek withdrawal of a group from a larger political entity. The U.S. Civil War is an example, where southern states sought to leave the U.S. federal union and create the Confederate States of America. Warlordism is different. These are not so much secession conflicts in a political sense, but rather, to quote Le Bihan, the expression of a phenomenon of armed warlordism in which areas of de facto sovereignty are often defined by commercial interests, such as the control of a mine or a forest or a drug production valley, in association with geographic military factors. The term warlord defines strongmen controlling an area through their ability to wage war, and who do not obey a higher central authority. A warlord's power and ability to keep weak central authorities and competing groups at bay largely depends on a war economy, which often includes integration into international commercial networks." End quote. In instances of warlordism, the rebels' desire to capture the central government or form a new state is unclear. Rather, they seek to prolong the conflict in order to continue running quasi-criminal economic enterprises in peripheral parts of the country. Perhaps the most successful warlord in modern times was Jonas Savimbi, the leader of the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, or UNITA, its Portuguese acronym. At the time of his death in 2002, Savimbi had amassed holdings of at least $800 million in Swiss bank accounts and significant land holdings in the United States. And most of these riches were amassed off the smuggling and sale of diamonds out of Angola's diamond-rich regions, which UNITA had controlled for much of that country's civil war. The literature identifies several mechanisms by which natural resource wealth may catalyze conflict. Mechanisms are important because they tell us how processes generate outcomes. Unless we know why something, like natural resource wealth, affects an outcome, we can't really devise policy solutions to try and change said outcome. We knew COVID was a disease and that it was causing severe respiratory problems, for example, but until we knew how it was being spread and how it worked physiologically, we couldn't design appropriate measures to halt its spread or combat cases on a case-by-case basis. At the structural level, natural resources exert both indirect and direct effects on conflict. We'll be focusing mostly on the direct effects, but there are indirect ones that operate through the mechanisms we discussed last week: delayed modernization leading to lower levels of economic development, more exclusionary political institutions, and weak state capacity. All of these structural factors raise the risk of civil conflict. All that said, there are 7 main pathways by which natural resource wealth is thought to affect the onset of civil conflict. First, the presence of a lootable resource provides a motive and means for potential rebels, making rebellion more likely. Second, the presence of a valuable non-lootable resource increases the value of state capture, making wars for control of the central government or coups more likely. Third, extraction of resources generates grievances among local populations who may pay the cost of extraction, but who do not receive a fair share of the benefits. Fourth, the presence of rich natural resources generates incentives for separatism, or the creation of a new state via the partitioning off of the resource-rich region from the larger state. Fifth, state dependence on natural resources leads to state weakness, making states less effective at deterring potential rebels and thus rebellion more likely. Sixth, resource wealth leads to foreign intervention, which causes a breakdown in state authority that creates an opportunity for armed groups to rebel. And finally, seventh, the promise of rebels capturing loot helps them find patrons who will underwrite their startup costs, making rebellion more likely. We'll discuss each of these pathways in turn. The lootable resources story is one that we've already discussed a bit. Blood diamonds refer to the rich diamond deposits in places like Angola and Sierra Leone that helped fuel conflicts there by providing rebels access to vast resources and facilitating the creation of warlord economies. In both countries, the diamond deposits were found in comparatively remote areas far from the capital. We've already discussed Sierra Leone's Kono diamond fields. In Angola, the richest diamond deposits were in the Lunda Norte province, again, far from the capital of Luanda and neighboring the Democratic Republic of Congo. Angola's diamond deposits are both alluvial and kimberlite in nature, like this kimberlite pipe open-pit mine near Lucapa. Turning to the second mechanism, valuable proximate point source resources increase the value of controlling the state. The same vast resources that allow resource-rich regimes to invest in repressing or buying off their populations also make it quite attractive to be the one in charge. Resource rents become the prize for controlling the state and can lead to violent bids for the government, such as coup attempts. An example of one such attempt was the 2004 coup attempt in Equatorial Guinea, a small oil-rich African country on the west coast of Central Africa. South African mercenaries were arrested in Harare, Zimbabwe, where they had stopped over to purchase arms for their planned attack on the Equatorial Guinean president, Teodoro Obiang. Another dozen or so conspirators were arrested in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea's capital city. The subsequent investigation would uncover that a network of British and South African financiers were behind the coup attempt, which was intended to depose the current government and replace it with one more friendly to their business interests. The case attracted a lot of attention in part because one of those financiers was Sir Mark Thatcher, son of the former Prime Minister of the UK, Margaret Thatcher.
What I feel, what I think. The only thing that I can say is, since only one side has given its arguments, it would be inappropriate to make any comment at this stage. And even were I to do so, it would be preempting the decision of the bench, which everybody will understand why I can't do at all. So that's all I've got to say. Okay, I'll see you all tomorrow.
He ultimately pled guilty to financing the coup plot and was given a 4-year suspended sentence and fined $560,000. The third mechanism relates to the imbalances that often emerge between the beneficiaries of resource extraction and the costs incurred by local populations. Mining and pumping oil and gas may be highly lucrative for some, but it usually entails pretty significant environmental costs. When these costs are concentrated in communities that do not reap a large portion of the benefits, severe grievances may arise, particularly if the local community is distinct in ethnic or religious terms from the dominant elite. Grievances over environmental costs and unequal access to benefits have been at the heart of rebel discourse in the Niger Delta, and it has been that way for decades. Oil is a central pillar of the Nigerian economy, accounting for nearly 90% of exports and 70% of government revenues. All of Nigeria's oil production, however, occurs in and around the Niger River Delta, which makes up only about 7.5% of Nigeria's landmass and about 20% of its population. Vast networks of small pipelines crisscross the landscape and are prone to leaks and sabotage. In the recent past, the region has averaged almost 420 oil spills per year. These spills foul freshwater resources, destroy important mangrove forests, and damage cropland. Of course, the oil industry also generates massive economic resources, but most of these resources leave the region, flowing to the federal government and transnational corporations like Royal Dutch Shell. Feeling marginalized, activists for the Ogoni and Ija, two tribal groups in the region, began protesting local environmental degradation and what they saw to be an unfair distribution of oil riches. These protests began peacefully, but were met with repression by the Nigerian government. In 2004, the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, or MEND, and Niger Delta People's Volunteer Force, or NDPVF, began an armed insurrection against the Nigerian government. Their claims revolved around reapportioning a greater share of the oil wealth to the affected states in the Niger Delta and providing more resources to clean up environmental damage. Their campaign wound down in 2009 under a government amnesty plan for former combatants. However, the region continues to have a lot of armed groups active in it, including, according to some reports, MEND fighters themselves.
We were led deep into the creeks of Nigeria's oil-rich Niger Delta region to meet the organization claiming to be behind Friday's bombing of the capital, Abuja. They met us halfway and guided us to their camp. In a heavily fortified compound, we found dozens of fighters for the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, known as MEND, armed to the teeth. They say they want the billions of dollars the Nigerian government makes from oil exports redistributed to communities in the region, branding their calls with the slogan, justice and equity.
You came on a boat. You saw with your own eyes. You saw the villages and whatever. Was there light, like power? No. No schools. No first aid point, dispensaries and whatever. Nothing. You'll be able to tell if it's an animal or a human being.
He then proceeded to show us stockpiles of new equipment they boasted will be used in overnight attacks on the installations of foreign oil companies. The Nigerian government claimed to have crushed MEND. These images appear to suggest the opposite. We were then allowed to walk freely around the camp for 10 minutes. This camp for MEND fighters is under construction, but it can be dismantled within about 3 hours and they can move to a new location entirely. Fighters are constantly on the move and their anger and frustration is palpable.
90% of this world belongs to us. You can see somebody from nowhere will come and start owning an oil well, whatever, in my own backyard. And me, I'm living here. This is my house. This is the oil well here. I don't even have a cup of oil. How do you justify that?
We then asked whether MEND were planning more attacks.
The attacks are on. They are on.
Less than 48 hours after this interview took place, this. The twin bombs MEND claim they planted in the Nigerian capital Abuja exploded, killing 12 people. If true, it's the first civilian location to be hit in the movement's history. And it's now emerged that several men have been arrested in connection with the bombings in Abuja who are linked to MEND, proof that the organization is still a force to be reckoned with.
The fourth mechanism relates to separatism. Valuable natural resources may also contribute to conflict by making a post-conflict independent territory an economically viable state. The economic logic here is pretty simple. Let's stick with the Niger Delta. Recall that oil accounts for nearly 90% of Nigerian exports and 70% of government revenues, but comes from a region with only about 20% of the population. Imagine if the Niger Delta were an independent country, and all those resources could be spread among a much smaller population. The MEND conflict is not the first time the Niger Delta has been at the heart of a violent conflict in Nigeria. The Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Biafran War, took place from 1967 to 1970. Although ethnic and other issues played a role in the conflict, the attempt at secession by the Republic of Biafra was made more credible and viable by the region's vast oil wealth. These types of resource-fueled secessionist movements are more likely when the resource-producing region is in a peripheral area, far from the capital, and when the people inhabiting that region are a distinct identity group, such as a different ethnicity, like the Ogoni and Ijaw in Nigeria. A more recent example was the eventual successful secession of South Sudan. Prior to its secession in 2011, South Sudan had accounted for 85% of Sudan's oil production, and the country has been mired in civil conflict almost since its birth, in part due to the competition over control of the government and the vast oil revenues that would come with it. The fifth mechanism is state weakness. Last week, we discussed how states with access to comparatively easy sources of revenue don't have the need to invest in creating and building bureaucratic and administrative state capacity. The decision to rebel considers the government's capacity to repress and to accommodate. States with considerable repressive capacity can impose more significant costs on potential dissidents and thus deter rebellion. And states capable of accommodating grievances via redistribution, the granting of autonomy rights, or the incorporation of distant movements within the party system will be more successful at placating restive groups and less likely to face armed dissent. And bureaucratic administrative capacity should also hamper the ability of armed groups to mobilize and conduct attacks, so countries with less of it will face more violent uprisings. The sixth mechanism relates to foreign intervention. The presence of high-value natural resources may make states targets for invasion by other states interested in controlling the first state's natural resource wealth. Prior to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Saddam Hussein's regime had ruled in a more or less stable fashion for almost 3 decades. The U.S. invasion of Iraq was not only about oil, but it was certainly among many motivations. And you don't have to take my word for it, as top U.S. military and political figures have attested to it in the years since. As recently as 4 years after the war began in 2003, U.S. administration officials were openly acknowledging this. Of course it was about oil. We can't really deny that, said General John Abizaid, former head of U.S. Central Command and military operations in Iraq, back in 2007. Former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan agreed, writing in his memoir, "I'm saddened that it is politically inconvenient to acknowledge what everyone knows. The Iraq War is largely about oil." Then Senator and later Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel said the same in 2007. People say we're not fighting for oil. Of course we are. The U.S. invasion led to the collapse of the Iraqi state, which opened space for dozens of armed groups to operate against both one another and U.S.-led coalition troops. Now, whether this mechanism operates frequently is a topic we'll turn to next week when we discuss the international security implications of natural resource wealth. The final mechanism is a concept of what Michael Ross calls, and it's hard not to smirk a bit when saying this, booty futures. Booty futures are essentially when armed groups or prospective armed groups solicit startup capital for their activities based on access to resources that they intend to capture in the future. Remember that Kono diamond fields were in eastern Sierra Leone next to the Liberian border? Well, Foday Sanko's RUF probably would not have been able to get off the ground if it hadn't been supported by Charles Taylor, the Liberian president who, as we discussed earlier, had taken control of Liberia after its own civil war. And Charles Taylor's support for the RUF, which included planning several of their major offensives, was motivated in part by the promise of repayment in diamonds. And the case of Equatorial Guinea earlier could be classified as a case of booty futures as well, where financiers fronted the capital to support a rebellion that would give them access to resources in that rebellion's aftermath. So now we return to the Angolan Civil War, one of the most tragic civil wars in terms of the pain inflicted on civilians. Why was the violence against them so intense? And why were the government and UNITA rebels seemingly so sanguine about civilian casualties? Well, on the one hand, you had Jonas Savimbi's UNITA rebel group, which had access to remote, diffuse resources with high value to weight, meaning they could raise revenue from illicit markets and thus not need to cater to the civilian population to curry support from them or generate resources. On the other hand, you had a government that was supported primarily by offshore oil revenues, and who thus did not have a fiscal contract with the people either. Neither group really had an economic incentive to provide that most basic of public services, i.e. safety, to the people. As an aside, the politics here made for very strange bedfellows. The Angolan government was aligned with Marxist movements, whereas the UNITA rebels were ostensibly pro-US. Their leader, Jonas Savimbi, was known to be able to quote George Washington and Thomas Jefferson at length, and even met with Ronald Reagan in the Oval Office. And during the war, UNITA rebels had hoped to attack the regime's source of revenue, including offshore oil platforms operated by the US-based Chevron Oil Company. To guard those oil platforms, Angola invited in Cuban soldiers and sailors, which meant that Cuba, a Marxist country, was supporting the global revolution of the proletariat by protecting a US oil firm. Next week, we'll turn to the way natural resource wealth shapes patterns of conflict in the international arena.